Bob Cicherillo isn't just another name in bodybuilding history. Born on December 1, 1965, in Rochester, New York, he became one of the most recognizable figures in the sport worldwide. But here's the interesting part. For a lot of people, Bob isn't remembered first as a competitor. He's remembered as the voice of bodybuilding's biggest stages. Even though he did compete professionally, the real standout chapter of Bob's journey happened away from the mandatory poses. With a microphone in hand, he built a unique identity as a host, commentator, and master of ceremonies. Over more than 2 decades, his voice became a constant presence at the biggest IFBB events, especially the Mr. Olympia, the most important stage in the sport. That kind of recognition didn't happen by accident. Bob pulled off something rare. He merged 3 different worlds into one person. He had the real-life experience of someone who endured extreme diets, trained to the absolute limit, and stood under the judges' scrutiny on stage. At the same time, he developed charisma, stage presence, and clear communication, making bodybuilding understandable not just to athletes, but to everyday fans as well. But long before the bright lights and major events, Bob's story begins in Rochester, New York. The city wasn't just his hometown. It was also a place where bodybuilding was already part of the local culture. Gyms, athletes, and competitions were all around, creating an environment that, even indirectly, helped shape the imagination of a young kid who was starting to dream big. As a child, Bob was heavily influenced by Marvel comic book superheroes. The Hulk, ultramuscular characters, and almost mythological figures sparked his admiration for powerful, imposing physiques. It wasn't just about looks. To him, strength represented power, identity, and overcoming limits. That fascination started to take real shape when his family gave him a simple set of weights. What might have been just a regular gift for most kids became a gateway to a whole new world for Bob. He started training at home, experimenting with movements, and paying attention to how his body responded, forming an early bond with the discipline of training. Between the ages of 12 and 15, while many teens were still bouncing from one hobby to another, Bob was already showing something different. He didn't see bodybuilding as just a fun pastime or a phase driven by vanity. Little by little, he understood that this path demanded routine, sacrifice, and consistency, and surprisingly, that didn't push him away. It pulled him in even more. Bob's first real test in competitive bodybuilding came in 1981, when he stepped on stage at the Natural America. Still very young, competing in the teen tall division, he finished in 4th place. It might sound modest, but for someone just starting out, that experience was huge. That's where Bob truly learned how the stage worked, what judging pressure felt like, and what it meant to compete for real. 2 years later, in 1983, came the first major confirmation that he was on the right path. Bob won the AAU Mr. New York State in the junior division and also took the overall title. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just showing up, he could actually win. And for an athlete, that realization changes everything. The real breakthrough happened in 1987, when Bob competed at the NPC Junior Nationals. Going up against some of the best names of the new generation, he won the heavyweight class and then the overall title. From that point on, Bob became a regular presence on the national NPC circuit, where the level of competition was absolutely brutal. Bodybuilding was going through a major transition, rapidly moving into what became known as the mass monster era. Bigger size, more body weight, and greater muscle density were being rewarded more than ever, raising the bar year after year. While many athletes turned pro in just a few seasons, Bob's story followed a very different route. Between 1987 and 1999, he lived through one of the longest and most demanding phases in bodybuilding, high-level amateur competition. Nearly 2 decades of competing year after year, always close to the top, but never quite getting that final breakthrough. During that stretch, Bob consistently appeared at the NPC Nationals and the NPC USA Championships. There were second-place finishes, strong placings, and results that clearly showed he had a pro-level physique. Still, the pro card never came, and every season ended with the same question hanging in the air. What was missing this time? The environment wasn't helping either. Bodybuilding was going through drastic changes, with an extreme emphasis on sheer muscle mass. Athletes were getting bigger, denser, and heavier every year. forcing Bob to constantly adapt just to stay competitive. That process came at a high cost. Diets became more aggressive, training methods more extreme, and the psychological pressure of having to win started wearing down not just his body, but his mind as well. Bob later admitted that this period was one of the toughest of his life, demanding sacrifices that went far beyond what the audience ever saw on stage. Even so, he didn't quit. And that's exactly why this phase matters so much in his story. After nearly 20 years of coming painfully close, the big moment finally arrived in 2000. At the NPC USA Championships, Bob stepped on stage in the super heavyweight division and delivered the best physique of his life. He didn't just win his class, he took the overall title as well. At 34 years old, he finally earned his long-awaited IFBB Pro card. That one carried massive weight. It wasn't just a competitive victory, it was proof that all the persistence from his amateur years had been worth it. Bob didn't reach the pro ranks as a young prodigy, but as someone forged by years of frustration, extreme discipline, and resilience. The following year, in 2001, he made his official pro debut at the Night of Champions. Competing for the first time against the world's elite, Bob finished in 11th place. It wasn't a headline-grabbing result, but it was an honest one. He was now sharing the stage with the biggest names in bodybuilding, athletes who had been defining the standard of the sport for years. This new landscape was ruthless. The IFBB was deep into an era dominated by massive physiques, with muscle volume far beyond anything fans had seen in previous decades. Still, that debut meant far more than a placing. It was confirmation that he finally belonged on that stage. From that point on, every contest would be a direct battle against the best in the world. Between 2001 and 2006, Bob lived his chapter as an IFBB professional, competing in a total of 12 shows. Those years were filled with intense challenges, as he went head-to-head with some of the biggest names in global bodybuilding, in an era where extreme size ruled everything. The year 2002 was, without question, the most consistent of his pro career. Bob took second place at the Night of Champions, one of the IFBB's most respected events, and repeated that result at the Southwest Pro Cup. Those performances proved he wasn't just filling out the lineup, but genuinely fighting among the best, even without being the biggest guy on stage. Later that same year, Bob achieved one of the ultimate dreams of any bodybuilder, competing at the Mr. Olympia. Although he finished in 18th place, the appearance carried enormous symbolic weight. Stepping onto that stage meant reaching the absolute summit of the sport, something only a small fraction of athletes ever accomplish. The following years stayed solid, with regular appearances and respectable placings, though no titles came his way. Then, in 2006, the most important moment of his competitive career arrived. At the IFBB Masters Pro World, Bob earned his first, and only, professional victory at 40 years old. A rare achievement, especially considering the physical wear accumulated over decades of competition. That same year, Bob once again qualified for the Mr. Olympia. After winning the IFBB Masters Pro World, he finally had the chance to return to bodybuilding's biggest stage as a reigning pro champion. For most athletes, that would be the ultimate payoff. But Bob shocked everyone by making an unexpected decision. He chose not to compete. Instead of stepping on stage as an athlete, Bob decided to take on the role of Master of Ceremonies for the event. This wasn't a last-minute move. He had already been hosting other shows, was clearly confident with a microphone in hand, and, most importantly, seemed completely at home guiding the entire spectacle. That choice wasn't a step back. It was a change in direction. That moment officially marked the end of his competitive career. After nearly 20 years as an amateur and 6 years as a professional, Bob knew his body had been pushed to its absolute limit. From that point on, Bob stopped being seen as just a former athlete and moved into a central role in the professional bodybuilding experience. His voice began guiding the audience, introducing competitors, and setting the pace for the most important moments of the Olympia. Very few athletes managed to stay relevant after retirement. Bob did the opposite. His relevance only grew. Starting in 2006, Bob entered the most defining phase of his entire bodybuilding journey. Away from physical competition, he stepped into a role few had imagined could be so powerful, Master of Ceremonies. That's when Bob officially became the voice of the sport's biggest stages. At the Mr. Olympia, his presence quickly became solidified. The deep voice, steady rhythm, and confidence speaking in front of thousands transformed the dynamic of the event. Bob didn't just announce names, he created atmosphere. Every athlete introduction, every strategic pause, and every result announcement helped build tension and emotion for the crowd. That same impact carried over to events like the Arnold Classic, Night of Champions, and numerous IFBB Pro League shows. Bob had something rare, the ability to improvise without ever losing control of the show. He understood stage timing, read the crowd's reaction, and knew exactly when to speed things up or slow them down. That made a huge difference in the live experience. Over time, his role became more than just technical. Bob became part of the Olympia's visual and sonic identity. Even away from competition, Bob never left the center of bodybuilding conversations. Offstage, he found another powerful way to influence the sport: direct communication with the audience. That's how Pro Bodybuilding Weekly was born, a show he co-hosted with Dan Solomon that became one of the first platforms fully dedicated to openly and consistently discussing bodybuilding. The show quickly gained relevance for going beyond results and trophies. Bob talked about behind-the-scenes details, contest prep, judging, internal politics, and the less glamorous side of professional bodybuilding. For many fans, it was the first time someone from the inside spoke without filters, and that completely changed how the public related to the sport. Years later, Bob took another step forward by launching his own podcast, The Voice of Bodybuilding. The name wasn't an exaggeration. The show became a hub for news, analysis, criticism, and controversy involving the IFBB and the NPC, reaching millions of views and turning into a go-to reference for anyone who wanted to understand what was really happening behind the scenes. Beyond audio, Bob also made a strong mark in print media. He wrote for classic magazines like Flex and Muscular Development, covering everything from training and bodybuilding culture to sensitive and controversial topics. Bob's visibility was never limited to bodybuilding alone. His imposing physique, combined with a strong personality, opened doors in the entertainment world. Gradually, he began appearing in movies, TV shows, and commercials, taking the image of the bodybuilder to an audience far beyond the traditional gym crowd. Among his most recognizable appearances were popular TV series like Malcolm in the Middle, where he showed up in comedic roles, playing on the contrast between extreme strength and everyday situations. In film, Bob also appeared in productions such as Dodgeball, See Arnold Run, and I Love You, Man. Even in smaller roles, his presence stood out immediately. One of the most symbolic roles of this phase was his portrayal of the gladiator Titan in the live events of the American Gladiators Live Tour. There, Bob perfectly merged his two worlds, real physical strength and pure spectacle. All of these experiences helped take Bob beyond the bodybuilding bubble and connect him with mainstream pop culture. Beyond the stages and microphones, Bob was also active behind the scenes of bodybuilding, in a much more delicate arena, the politics of the sport. At one point in his career, Bob took on the role of athlete representative within the IFBB, becoming a direct bridge between competitors and the organization. His main message was always clear: athletes needed to be valued more. Bob openly pushed for higher prize money, better judging conditions, and greater respect for the financial and physical sacrifices required to be a professional bodybuilder. He played an active role in discussions that led to meaningful changes, especially at the Mr. Olympia. Adjustments to the event's structure, increased prize money, and more open dialogue with athletes became part of the conversation. Even when his proposals weren't fully accepted, the debate itself was already a step forward. Of course, that stance also created resistance. Not everyone within the IFBB or the bodybuilding community agreed with his direct approach. Some saw Bob as necessary, others as a nuisance. But one thing is undeniable: he forced the spotlight onto an issue many preferred to ignore: how difficult it really is to sustain a career in professional bodybuilding. With that level of exposure and influence, it was almost inevitable that Bob would become a controversial figure. In recent years, his work as a host and commentator has been increasingly questioned by parts of the bodybuilding community. Comments seen as over-the-top, attitudes interpreted as arrogant, and public conflicts started to divide fans, athletes, and officials. Many began criticizing how Bob handled interviews, made onstage remarks, or positioned himself on social media and podcasts. For some, he was simply being straightforward and honest, as he always had been. For others, he had crossed a line between entertainment, personal opinion, and respect for the athletes. Those tensions didn't stay limited to opinions. Over time, public calls emerged asking for Bob to be removed from certain events, including debates about whether he should remain as master of ceremonies at major competitions. The most sensitive moment came when he stepped down from his role as athlete representative, a position he held specifically to defend competitors' interests. Many saw that departure as a direct result of the conflicts that had built up over the years, both with officials and within the community. Even so, one thing remains clear. Bob continues to be one of the most talked about figures in modern bodybuilding. Loved by some, criticized by others, he's still right at the center of the conversation. Despite spending decades under the bodybuilding spotlight, Bob has always kept his personal life away from excessive exposure. He has been married to Tasha Gaskin since 2006 and is the father of a daughter. Unlike many figures in the sport, Bob never built his public image around his family, choosing instead to keep that part of his life more private and protected. That discretion stands in sharp contrast to the firm, direct personality he shows on stage and behind the microphone. Outside the spectacle, Bob has always aimed for a more stable routine, balancing professional commitments, travel, and family responsibilities. When it comes to legacy, though, it's impossible to sum Bob up by titles or placings alone. His impact goes far beyond physique or competition results. Bob represents a major shift in how bodybuilding has been presented to the public, especially from the early 2000s onward. He was one of the key figures in turning the sport into a true spectacle, a media product and a form of entertainment. His voice, event leadership, and constant presence helped create a more accessible, dramatic, and engaging narrative, bringing fans who had never set foot in a gym closer to the world of professional bodybuilding. After seeing this entire journey, one thing becomes clear. Bob's story isn't just about muscles, trophies, or microphones. It's about persistence, reinvention, and the courage to find new paths when many others would have quit. Now I want to hear from you. What's your take on Bob Cicherillo? Was he more important as a competitor or as a communicator? Do you agree with the criticism, or do you think he was essential in turning bodybuilding into a true spectacle? Drop your opinion in the comments. This kind of debate strengthens the community and makes the channel better. And if this video helped you better understand the behind-the-scenes world of bodybuilding and the figures who shaped the sport, don't forget to hit that like button.